The validation settings allow users to configure the front-end and back-end validations for a field. Before we look into these settings, however, let's briefly review how the validation system works. There are two types of validations that occur on a form: front-end validation from the client and back-end validation from the server. Front-end validation takes place when a user interacts with input fields and the data input fails to meet the validation criteria. An example of this is not meeting the minimum length validation requirement for a field. Back-end validation is triggered by the server when an API call takes place on the form, such as when a user attempts to submit the form without filling out required fields. When triggered, front-end validation is represented by a red border inside the field, and a validation error message will also display underneath the field. Every component shares the same default validation message depending on what kind of validation is set. This validation message can be modified within the validation settings of a field. So an example of front-end validation, I have an enter your age field with a validation minimum value set to 18. So if I input 15 here, I'll get a red border inside the field as well as the validation message underneath the field. The backend validation will display a red alert box at the top of the form. So if I submit the form here, I have some required fields. The API call is going to hit the server, and that server will return the backend server validations. The server-side validation displays all of the components that need attention and allows the end user to click on each of these components from the alert box, and that will navigate the user to the component on the form. If I click first name here, you'll see the focus of my cursor go to first name. If I had a larger form here, and I click the alert message and click to component, it would scroll down to that component on the form. The form submit button will also turn red, indicating there are errors on the form that need correcting. Once validation has been met for a single field, the red field will revert back to its original state, and the component will be removed from the server-side validation alert. Once all validation has been complete, all validation alerts and messages will be removed from the form, and the form will return to its previous state. Back to the settings. The first setting in the validation tab is the validate on setting, which determines when the front-end validation will occur in the field. The default option change will trigger validation anytime there's a change happening inside the field. Blur will trigger validation when the field is no longer in focus, or in other words, when the user clicks out of the field. So an example of this, I have two email fields, one with the validate on change and the other with the validate on blur. The email has a default validation where the validation will trigger if the data is not meeting an email format. So for on change, as I'm typing into the field, I'm immediately going to get my validation message, and that validation message won't go away until I meet the criteria. The on blur, however, I can type in, and the validation will not occur until I click out of the field. So this is a great example of when to use a validate on blur versus on change. You don't want the validation message to be triggered for your end user as they're typing in their email address. So use the on blur for emails. The required setting forces the end user to enter a value or select a value in the field before the form can be submitted, and is represented by a red asterisk next to the field label. If the form is submitted with an empty required field, the server-side validation will trigger and will not be removed until the end user enters a value into the required field. The unique setting is a server-side validation and ensures the data being submitted into the field does not have a corresponding match within the database. If I go back to my form here and click the Data tab, I already have a submission with the email tests@example.com. So I'm going to use the form again, fill it out, and I'm going to use that same email address. And when I submit, I should get a server-side validation saying the email must be unique. This is helpful for things like email fields on registration forms to ensure users cannot register using the same email address. The minimum and maximum link validation determines the number of characters or numeric value the field must meet before passing validation. The setting behaves differently depending on the component the validation is being applied to. For string-based fields such as text fields or text areas, the validation process will assess the character count within the field. So here I have a text field with a minimum length set to 3. If I enter character count less than 3, front-end validation will trigger. For number-based fields like the currency or number component, the validation will determine the numeric value being entered into the field. Here I have a number component with a minimum value set to 3. Any value less than 3, I will also receive the front-end validation. Finally, for components that are stored as arrays, such as data grids or edit grids, the validation assesses the number of arrays or rows for that particular component. Here I have a data grid with a minimum length set to 3 and a maximum length set to 5. You can see that my data grid behaves differently when the form is rendered. I will automatically have 3 rows set on my form. And if I add rows up to 5, my add another button will be removed and I'll be unable to add additional rows past the maximum value. The regular expression pattern, often referred to as regex, allows users to apply a pattern or filter that details a set of strings that must match the pattern before the form can be submitted. This is often used in password fields to ensure the user inputs certain characters or enforces a password link before something like a registration form can be submitted. So here I have a regular expression pattern set on this password field, which requires uppercase, lowercase characters, as well as numbers and special characters. As I type into the field here, I get a validation message. You can also apply certain dynamic validation messages as your validation is being met for the expression pattern. You can also use things like tooltips to give the user indication on what kind of password they must input before they can submit the form. The error label replaces the default label name within the front-end validation with a custom label provided by the user. This can be helpful if a field has a long descriptive label, and it's preferable to utilize a distinct name to represent the component within the validation message. By default, validations use the front-end label of the component included in the front-end validation message. For example, I have some required fields here, so you can see first name, last name is required. Here I have a field that says please enter your first name. If I don't want that entire label to be included inside the validation message, I can replace that with a error label, which here is detailed as first name. That way, whenever the validation is triggered, I get first name is required instead of this full label length. The custom error message overrides the default validation message that appears below a field when front-end validation is triggered. Here I have a required first name field. Normally that would say first name is required when my validation is triggered. That will be replaced with this string. We can see that as we try to progress through the wizard page here.